The most important legacy of Silent Spring was a new public awareness that nature was vulnerable to human intervention. Carson had made a radical proposal that at times technical progress was so fundamentally at odds with natural processes that it must be curtailed. The book is dedicated to Albert Schweitzer with his quote, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and forestall. He will end up by destroying the earth." Man's attitude towards nature is totally critical importance simply because we now have acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man is part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. We are challenged as mankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but ourselves. If she was alive today, what advice would she give us about pesticides, forests, birds, animals, oceans and rivers, climate warming, limits to growth and ecological footprints, the role of business and government regulators, and ethics? This is a direct quote from Pesticide Atlas 2022. Today, 60 years after Carson's book was released, greater amounts of pesticides are now being used worldwide than ever before, despite stricter approval regulations and voluntary as well as binding agreements on the handling of pesticides. 1.2 million Europeans have already signed the European Citizens Initiative, Save Bees and Farmers, to demand more ambitious reduction targets than those proposed by the Farm to Fork strategy. The initiative is calling for an 80% reduction in the use of chemical pesticides by 2030 and a complete phase-out by 2035. The global market for pesticides is highly lucrative. A few well-connected and influential agrochemical companies are expanding their control over the market and thriving for always increasing profits. At the forefront, European companies like Bayer and BASF. The EU is the largest pesticide export market in the world, now investing more and more countries in the global south, where EU companies are allowed to export pesticides banned on their own due to their harmful effects on human health and the environment. And before I leave that, I should refer you to a Guardian article that I will I just lost the reference, but there's a Guardian article which is talking about how the European government is actually being given in by immense pressure from the pesticide lobby in Europe to reduce and not, in fact, restrict really quite harmful pesticides. The world has a total forest area of 4.6 billion hectares, which is 31% of the total land area. But the area is shrinking despite efforts to halt deforestation and restore degraded lands. The FAO Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020 estimated that 420 million hectares of forest was deforested. That's converted to other land uses between 1990 and 2020. The State of the World's Birds, an annual review of environmental resources published by 9 natural sciences and avian specialists across the globe, has revealed that the population of 48% of the 10,994 surviving species of birds is declining. A major reason for this reduction could be attributed to the continued growth of the human footprint on the natural world, which has led to the degradation and loss of natural habitats and the direct overexploitation of many species. These are the key threats to avian biodiversity. Animal welfare. The Australian philosopher Pete Singer's book, published in 1975, exposed the realities of life for animals in factory farms and testing laboratories, and provided a powerful moral basis for rethinking our relationship to them. He argued that animals experience pain and are therefore entitled to proper care. This has led to a reduction of animal experimentation, but not a reduction in industrial agriculture, with its continued harmful living conditions and treatment of animals. In 2019, 32 countries had formally recognised non-human animal sentience, that's been able to experience feelings. Pleased to say that New Zealand was one of those 32. Carson was a marine biologist. She would have been appalled at the ocean and river pollution throughout the world. She would have supported the outcomes of Montreal COP15 and the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, a goal to conserve 30% of the world's land and 30% of the ocean by 2030. Climate warming, the reaction by the chemical industry to Carson's work was nasty, personal, and inaccurate. She would have been dismayed, but not surprised, at a similar failure of the fossil fuel industry to look no further than their profit margins. And also no surprise at the failure of the regulatory and political bodies to act independently on behalf of the whole world community. Published in 1972, this work was the first to model our planet's interconnected systems and to make it clear that if growth trends in population, industrialisation, resource use and pollution continued unchanged, we would reach and then overshoot the carrying capacity of the Earth at some point in the next 100 years. Carson would have supported this analysis because of her understanding of the connectedness of life. She would have given similar support to the idea of an ecological footprint conceived in 1990 by Matthias Wackernagle and William Rees at the University of British Columbia. Rees was a professor and Matthias was his PhD student. The ecological footprint adds up to the biologically productive areas for which a population, a person, or a product competes. It measures the ecological assets that a given population or product requires to produce the natural resources it consumes, including plant-based food and fibre products, livestock, fish products, timber, and other forest products, space for urban infrastructure, and to absorb its waste, especially carbon emissions. So if you take, say, the city of Auckland, what is its ecological footprint? You've got to include the land, which includes growing food that is outside the voting boundaries of Auckland City, and all the other aspects, and that's how you get the ecological footprint. The 2022 data shows that current global ecological footprint is about 1.75 planets. That means that the world needs almost 2 Earths to be able to support its lifestyle. Some commentators state Boulding's essay in 1966 as one of the most influential essays on environmental policy. It presented a template for a sustainable society with its cowboy and spaceship analogy. The cowboy economy being symbolic of the illimitable plains and associated with reckless, exploitative, romantic, and violent behaviour, which is characteristic of open societies. The spaceman economy is an economy without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution. Man must find his place in a cyclic ecological system which is capable of continuous reproduction of material form, and it cannot escape having inputs of energy. That's from his essay, The Economics of Coming Spaceship Earth, 1966. The Earth Charter. The idea of the Earth Charter originated with Morris Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987 as members of the Club of Rome, when the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development called for a new charter to guide the transition to sustainable development. Initially, it was prepared for the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. The green cross motif there is Gorbachev's non-profit organisation that he set up. Morris Strong was a Canadian very long and a very successful businessman, but with a long-standing interest in the environment. In 1992, some 1,700 of the world's leading scientists, including the majority of Nobel laureates in the sciences, issued their warning to humanity. The scientists stated that the Earth is finite, its ability to absorb wastes and destructive effluent is finite, its ability to provide food and energy is finite, its ability to provide for growing numbers of people is finite, and we are fast approaching many of the Earth's limits. A new ethic is required, a new attitude towards discharging our responsibility for caring for ourselves and the Earth. The United Nations Secretary General last year said keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive requires a 45% reduction in global emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by mid-century. We are sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. In our globally connected world, no country and no corporation can insulate itself from these levels of chaos. And the UNEP said there's no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees limit. The Economist last November quoted Accenture, a consultancy, where it said around 1/3 of the world's 2,000 biggest firms by revenue have publicly stated net zero goals. That means 2/3 don't. 93% have no chance of achieving their targets without doing much more than they are at the moment. Few businesses lay out credible investment plans or timelines against which progress can be judged. Schweitzer, quoted by Carson, said, "The great fault of ethics hitherto is that they deal only with relations of man to man. A man is ethical only when all life is sacred to him, that of plants and animals as well as his fellow men. We need a universal ethic of feeling responsible for our ever-widening sphere for all that lives, the ethic of reverence for life." Carson was not a philosopher or an ethicist, but she recognised the need to change the exploitative relationship between humanity and the earth. She urged us to live in harmony with nature, to preserve and learn from the natural places of the world. Nature was a source of regeneration. She would have encouraged us to support the ideas and actions from people such as Schweitzer, Boulding, the Club of Rome, Morris Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev, Rees, Wackenagel, and the other authors who were born on their works. She would have been in the forefront of the union of concerned scientists. ESR's first two objectives are to encourage and support social responsibility and a humane professional use of technology, and to inform the engineering profession, general public and public policy about the impact of technology using positive and negative effects. But what does ESR mean by social responsibility? What does it mean by can you go back up again? What does it mean by social responsibility and a humane professional ethic? Is it time to rethink the Union of Concerns challenge, and how can caring for people on the planet be advanced by ESR? I just want to briefly talk about what is the moral domain, give levels of that domain with an example of animal welfare, issues of validity, and codes of conduct. Next slide, please. The moral domain, now you've skipped one too quickly. Go down again. Next slide. The moral domain consists of judgments of worth or values that are deemed by society to be necessary for the public good and its safety. There are three levels: ordinary language, right, wrong, bad, good, obligation, duty, responsibility. We use these terms in everyday life. For example, when we talk about a parental responsibility for children. These terms are also found in schema, which are codes of conduct or laws, charters, creeds, or policies. And these are sets of rules for describing values, standards, cultural customs, and policies that define acceptable behaviour. For example, employer human rights policies. Those are policies that define the responsibilities of the employer towards the employee, but they also define the responsibility of the employee towards the employer. And then the next level is the key concept of principle. These are, for example, do no harm, responsibility, sustainability, guardianship, integrity. There are others. Next slide, please. Public good and safety values are enshrined in fundamental humanitarian principles, such as the UN Charter. In New Zealand, there are laws, the Human Rights Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Wildlife Act. There are conventions and agreements that New Zealand has signed up to, the Convention on Biological Diversity. We have policies for trees, kauris, endangered species, Maori dolphin, the protection of wilderness, national parks. There are codes of conducts, Forest Stewardship Council certification, and organisational policies. And then we have the Maori values, mana arititanga, equality and fairness, and kai tia kitanga, guardianship, stewardship, care. Next slide, please. An example of animal welfare and how these levels work. Singer, in his book, gave the philosophical considerations that I talked about earlier. That's been those principles have been enshrined in New Zealand legislation, the Animal Welfare Act of 1999, where we cannot cause animals to suffer, to be in pain or distress. Under the Act, of National Animal Welfare Ethics Committee have been set up, and they establish codes of conduct. These are minimum standards, the way in which persons care for animals, and include recommendations on best practice. And there are a number of those codes, as there are a number of ethical committees for the various types of animals. Chickens, the code of conduct of what they call it welfare for layer hens was reviewed in 2012, and farmers were given until the end of 2022 to change to more humane housing for chickens. Some were slow, and that's why we have issues with the cost of eggs today. Next slide, please. The Ombudsman, in a very important report called the Regulatory Policy Design During COVID-19 Pandemic, states, Crown treaty obligations, human rights, and international law obligations form an important part of an ombudsman's investigation and review of agencies' practices and decisions. This means that the policy design and implementation should reflect the democratic and constitutional principles of Aotearoa New Zealand law, including the Treaty of Waitangi. And later on, he had so many applications about people being stranded overseas last year, and he judged those to have been a breach of human rights, as did the High Court. Next slide, please. Many codes and practices and policies are invalid. I refer you to a YouTube presentation that I gave. How can we as individuals invest to prepare for a 2 degrees Celsius plus world? And I go through there with the examples of investment about how many codes and policies with regard to government investment are invalid. The method of establishing validity, whether it's ethical, is validation. It takes 2 steps, content and construct. Content validity requires consideration at a conceptual level. Does the measure make sense? Is it consistent and comprehensive? Construct validity requires empirical considerations. Is the application of the measure consistent with other empirical evidence? Next slide, please. The State Services Commission's Code of Integrity and Conduct for Government Departments and Crown Entities talks about integrity, the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, trustworthiness, avoiding activities, work or non-work, which may harm the reputation of your organisation or the state services, and responsibility to act lawfully and objectively. Next slide, please. The State Services Commission should be updated to include obligations for human earth matters. In other words, it's not valid to cover all ethical issues because it excludes those factors. And at the moment is interpreted just to apply to individuals. It should apply to all government departments and agencies as well, with an annual report on conformity to that code and a requirement for papers to the Cabinet to be evaluated by that code. All companies and civil society entities should have upgraded codes of conduct that describe how they will operate fairly and as guardians of the health and safety of the planet, in the same way that companies are required to ensure the health and safety of their employees, report annually. Auckland Airport, for example, has go back a bit, Jeff. Auckland Airport has a code of conduct where its board members are personally held responsible for the health and safety of their employees. But when it comes to the health and safety of the planet, that's excluded. So what I'm arguing is that they should have codes of conduct that are comprehensive and apply in the same way that the law at the moment requires for board members to be responsible for the health and safety of the employees. Next slide, please. So these are my questions. Does ESR have a code of conduct? Is there a code of conduct for all engineers working in New Zealand? Is that code, if there is one, validated, i.e., is it comprehensive? Does it include all human and human earth factors? Does it include not just climate warming matters, but all the dimensions related to our deteriorating world, such as biodiversity, pollution, including plastics? And ESR objectives mention about, I think it's another 5 dealing with the environment. Are there ethical committees for its application in the many branches of engineering? In other words, in the same way that the Animal Welfare Act talks about chickens, is there an application in branches of engineering for codes of conduct and committees for chemicals, for example? Next slide, please. I just want to briefly go through an example of simplicity where I identified 4 categories, which includes both human and human earth relationships overall. And next slide, please. So the checklist, and I don't want to go through all of this, but hopefully it will be available on the ESR website due course. And I'll give you some examples. Does a company's code of conduct or its statement of its values include both human and human earth responsibilities? Does 2A, does the company have a policy manual or its equivalent that describes how its obligations under the UDHR and IOL conventions? Does it pay a living wage, etc.? So what I've done is gone through the UDHR and the conventions of ILO and put those into question forms. And those are based primarily on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Next example, next page, please. Are its decision makings or promotion and marketing reporting activities? Does it have statements in its purpose, governance, policies, codes of conduct, grievance and complaints procedures, etc.? Then the human earth dimension, does it report on its ecological footprint and efforts to reduce it? Does it include in its code the human earth dimension, including abuse of animals? Does it adhere 3.2 to the Convention on Biological Diversity? In regard to forestry stewards at council, how does it match up with the principles 3, 4, 5 and 6? Next slide, please. Does it protect individual trees and tree types on grounds that incorporate cultural and historical factors? Does it protect rivers, lakes, oceans from its discharge from its forests? The recent storms up in Gisborne and so forth would be quite pertinent here. Does it measure or report its ecological impact on land and soil, etc.? So what I'm suggesting is that if ESR wants to use a framework to go through and identify the various aspects of our world, it could well use this as a framework. Next slide, please. So my questions are based on an understanding of the moral domain, the need for validation, the respective functions for ethical principles, codes of conduct, and their linkage to the implementation of ethical rules and accountability for that implementation. And I've given you an example with the Animal Welfare Act, but that pattern is not applied to many examples of various branches of behaviour in the way we relate to the earth in the various categories that I've identified. And if those questions are relevant to ESR, then that's my contribution to acknowledge the life and inspiration of Rachel Carson and others who have been inspired by her.
What intrigues me in all of this is growing up in the 60s, there was so much about the population bomb, population explosion, and now very little link of the environmental issues and pollution and deforestation and all climate change, all of the issues. They're all linked to the dramatic population increase that is continuing. And I guess in our world we live in, it's hard to question that in any way, shape, or form. But once we hit 9 billion people, I mean, how many planets do we need? And is there anything any of us can do about that?
It's a really good question, Hugh. I think population is part of the mix. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. I think population is one of the factors. Interestingly enough, in the Labour Party environmental sector seminar that they held earlier this year, Len Cook was one of the presenters, and he was asked to talk about the social factors relevant to a 1.5 to 2 degrees plus warming. And the major social implication he talked about was population. And he presented projections of the population changes in New Zealand over the next 20 or so years by district, and showed that with age changes, rapidly aging population, and various other things, that significant areas of New Zealand would be in population decline, and the economic implications of that. So it's not just at a global level, that works out in a whole variety of ways. I just think part of the problem is that with population, in theory, the world has got enough resources to feed and to look after 9 billion people, but not at the standard of living that is lived by the elite. So if we all if we all lived simply within the planetary boundaries, we could do it, but it would require massive changes in terms of the distribution of wealth throughout the world.
James Renwick, which is one of the commissioners of the climate change, New Zealand climate change, with his book Under the Weather, for the first time I've seen in print where someone actually tackles the problem of climate change. And he makes a comparison that a New Zealander's carbon footprint is about 80 times bigger than an African's carbon footprint. So whenever you look at a New Zealand baby, you're looking at 80 African babies. And he says, you know, the greatest thing any of us can do about reducing our carbon footprint, especially as families, is to have one fewer child. And I think it's time we actually started to address that elephant in the room.
So I agree with all of that.
Yes, Greta Thunberg put this book together recently, and I read it through, and there was all about climate change, but there was nothing about population. And the human population's about 2.5 times bigger than it was when I was born. It's yeah. I thought you said that.
Thank you very much, Robert, for an excellent presentation. And there are a lot of pointers in there for ESR and for any organisation to think about how it behaves. And the challenge, it seems, is for us all to be setting a course of action towards positively influencing the future, most especially in the long term, as the key moral priority of our time. And it's good to see that probably we're the first generation where we're trying to pave the way for future generations, for the well-being of future generations. Some of us are starting to think along those terms, instead of just, instead of it being just on a family matter, making life easier for your grandkids, but on a more of a global matter. And the idea of having, codes of conduct and so on along these lines, which are just not human-centric, but are all about the environment as well. So yes. I have another question for you then, Robert. What motivates you to come to do this sort of work?
Well, when I was a young teenager, I got interested in philosophical and ethical questions, and that was one of the subjects that I took at university. But the ethics that I was taught was the traditional ethics, the frameworks of Aristotle, utilitarianism, and so on. But at that stage, it was all human. How do humans relate to other humans? What are the rules for their behaviour? And it was only much later that I started to come back to the ethical issues. And in part, it was contributed to the fact that I was invited to participate in 2 think tanks. One was a Quaker one in North America, and the other was the Sustainable Aotearoa New Zealand group, which included a number of people like John Peet and others, Wayne Cartwright. The characteristic of these two think tanks was that they were multidisciplinary, and I think that you just can't afford to work in silos these days. You need to work in teams of various disciplines, and I found that they challenged me with both knowledge and my understanding of things like ethics. And I went back and read a lot and discovered that the whole area of environmental ethics had developed, that I hadn't really done a lot of work in that. So I read very widely. And I guess that it's my focus, not just at the academic level, but the implications of that for strategies and policies and organisational change. So I've had one foot in the academic world and one foot in the consulting and practical world, where I've run my own organisations and so on. In some areas, I've had a particular focus on investment, but it's been much wider than that. So that's what's prompted me. And I mean, the challenges are immense, and and I want to be able to talk those issues through with other colleagues in other organisations, and so that's what keeps me going.
Can I pipe up briefly? Just coming back to the population thing, and it kind of seems to me that those of us that are rich in global terms, that means, say, we have more than $150,000 worth of assets, we are a great deal of the problem. I think it's those who reach that level use 50% of the world's resources, and we eat a lot of meat, and we use a lot of fossil fuel, use a lot of other resources. It kind of seems like people in our category are the ones that can make quite a big difference if we were able to change our lifestyles. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what sort of a life we might lead that wasn't so resource intensive.
Hugh, I think that's some good points. I've just been rereading Pete Singer's The Life You Can Save, which talks about the way in which he challenges people from an ethical point of view about the existence of poverty. Highly recommended. And he talks about the fact that when people are really challenged, when they've got these large stashes of wealth, it doesn't improve their happiness necessarily, just having more wealth. And it's really underdeployed. That is, that they don't need all that wealth. So that's highly recommended, The Life You Could Save by Pete Singer. In terms of how one can reduce the global impact if you are wealthy is I think to participate in these sorts of issues, seminars and so forth. So I think ESR, part of its responsibility, I believe, if it wants to follow through its principles, is to start challenging people about these. I would say that while population is a factor, there are other factors as well. The book that Sustainable Aotearoa New Zealand produced is the idea of population being an important factor is there, but there are others as well, and that's a little book that they produced about 10 years ago, which I've found very useful. There are times where I still start quoting that. But I think also that at the moment in New Zealand, anyway, when we talk about the threat of climate warming, we don't recognise that the wealth distribution and the wealth of the extreme of the elite, which in part was identified by David Parker when he talked about the fact, whether they actually paid taxes. One of the other factors is that if we really are going to deal with climate warming, we have to deal with that segment of the population which contributes the most, and that's the rich elite. It's the old 80-20 rule, which I don't believe I need to tell engineers what that is. But it's part of a discussion that we need to link. We need to link the climate warming challenge to the social and the economic factors. We need to change the way we run and think about what an economy should look like. That's the building stuff. And we also need to start looking at the way we use resources, as you've identified.
Robert, just touching on another aspect that interested me from your talk. You were talking about codes of ethical conduct and whether they were valid and stood up to, not just human reaction relationships. And it made me think of the code of conduct that governs professional engineers in New Zealand, which is the Engineering New Zealand Code of Ethical Conduct, and whether that's fit for purpose. So probably 30 years ago, ESR had quite a role in advocating that the previous code of conduct was sort of sorely lacking and needed to be brought up to date sort of in the mid-90s, and eventually carried the day, and there were some quite big changes, and we ended up, I can probably just share screen briefly, right? So yeah. I walk past this in my office every day, and it has become sort of increasingly obvious to me that the first item, protect people's health and safety, is quite a strong call to action in terms of you must protect something. But the second item, consider the environment, is sort of worded a fair bit weaker, where you could perhaps say that you've met the ethical standard if you thought about protecting the environment and decided that your profits were more important. It's just sort of perhaps an example of what you're talking about, where environmental concerns are perhaps seen as a step down or not as important. So yeah, it does make me think, perhaps it's something I've been wondering about, whether ESR might need to advocate again, or raise the question, is that code of conduct really still appropriate these days? Don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
If my talk has done nothing but ask that question, for you to ask that question, then my time has been very well spent. And I would recommend the animal welfare pattern, the various levels, your principles, going down to codes. That the principles need to be embedded in codes, and the codes start to really spell out the rules for what is acceptable behaviour, and then you have the implementation of that. I think that's a pattern that's really worth looking at. Yes, if as I say, if I've prompted you as an organisation to re-look at that, then it's been a very successful, in spite of the technical difficulties, very successful evening for me.
Robert, my name is Stuart. I'm a new member. I wrote several years ago sort of a method of how chartered engineers had to behave for the Energy Institute, which is based in London, and recently returned to the country. I put the ethics together based on the ethics that doctors, solicitors, and someone else had to abide by, architects, I think. And I sort of put that together, but also with the addendum to it that if someone actually, a client, went to the Energy Institute to employ a chartered engineer, and they didn't quite do the job correctly, then someone else on the list would actually come in and rectify the wrongs that were done. I particularly like your idea of looking at a much wider view of the subject of ethics and outcome and environmental outcomes, so that if one was commissioned to do work, I'm retired, but if one was commissioned, then you'd really have to identify what the environmental outcome of the project that you were doing, whether it was design for a factory or whatever, was. I think that would be a really good move forward. There's obviously quite a lot of the carbon footprint of New Zealand, which is actually sat overseas, and manufacturing of Miele washing machines and importing them from Germany is something that these are sort of imported things. I'm not quite sure how you'd handle that, but I sort of like the concept that one would have to, rather than a single line on a piece of paper, perhaps engineers had to respond and do an environmental assessment at each design that they were doing, and that could actually then, particularly if it was involved in a repeat thing, something like housing, the effect of that could be quite massive for the footprint of the whole country if that was clearly identified at point of design. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Stuart. I think that there are most probably examples overseas that we could learn from in a whole variety of ways. When I look at overseas, the area where I believe the lead has been taken is the EU. I think that they are they're ahead of us in New Zealand in a whole variety of ways. But it's not just it's not just environment that I'm wanting. I'm wanting to say that you also have to be. There are a whole variety of responses in a human obligation. You know, you have to act with integrity to your client. You have to be honest with them, etc., etc. So while I've emphasised the environmental aspect, that's really important, and that's what Rachel Carson really, I think, alerted the world to do.
I want to come back to the population. I'm looking at some figures here which showed that in 1800, about 70% of the people alive in the world were living below the poverty line, and then by 1975, half the people were living below the poverty line, and the developed countries had accelerated way up. But by now, 2019, only 10% of this 8 billion population are living below the poverty line. These are great achievements. The problem, and it's not enough to go backwards. If we've achieved a living style, the answer isn't to go backwards to those times. I mean, just think of and it's not so much the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Think of a very wealthy man in 1800 with toothache, and the pain and suffering and all that happened in toothache. We don't want to go back there. But we could have the lifestyle we're having if we're still 1 billion people. We didn't have to blow out to 8 billion people. And I'll make this point. Also, when we're looking at the future, there's a whole new movement now in the book, What We Owe the Future, recommended by Ross in the latest ESR newsletter, and looking at different ways that we should be thinking about the future. One of them is to keep some coal in the ground so that if there is ever a collapse in the future of civilization, there is some fossil fuels that are easily available for the recovery of civilization. There are these things we need to be thinking about too. Don't know if you want any comment on that, Robert.
In the meantime,
Um,
we have it. Sorry.
Where you go, Hugh?
I was just going to say, in the meantime, we have like a demographic winter. What are you going to do with those 7 billion people? You know, everyone that's alive has got a right to be alive. And it seems to me that we have to scale back our expectations. I wouldn't like there to be no antibiotics, and I wouldn't like there to be no dentists. But there's probably a whole lot of things that I could give up and still have a perfectly satisfactory life, and a life that wasn't so destructive of nature.
There are whole. I don't believe that there is one silver bullet that's going to solve it all. I think it's a number of factors. But if you look at the TV news these days, the heat waves that are going throughout the world, the fires that are going throughout the world, there are places in the world at the moment that by and large are uninhabitable. You just can't really live in them. And so the low-hanging fruit stuff, the time has gone for those. We're now in a transition to a very chaotic, disruptive, turbulent future, which is going to have major implications for the world economy, including our economy. So the business as usual model's got to change. It's going to be forced to change. And how do we ride those changes? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd kind of agree with that. I think nature will take over because the incoming energy is 9,000 times the solar energy that comes in. Solar radiation is 9,000 times our human primary energy demand, and we are buggering up the thermostat. And those of us that grew up fixing our own cars know what happens when you bugger up the thermostat. It's a very powerful system, and we kind of, once you let that thermostat break down and the radiation balance run out of control, it just becomes huge. And I think nature will start to kick our backsides.
Sure. From an engineering point of view, my recommendation as a non-engineer is, and I don't know your work program and I don't know your priorities, so I'm coming at it from a bit of ignorance here, but it seems to me that I have done a presentation based on my expertise, which is sort of ethics, the philosophical stuff, strategic planning. I would say to engineers, what is the thing that you can talk about for which you are eminently qualified to talk about that nobody else can talk about? What is that contribution that you can make? You've got a contribution to make in the wider discussion, like you've just talked about, Hugh, living without dentists, if that has to be. So I would say choose your targets or your goals that you want to work on, and identify those or prioritize those according to where your strengths, your expertise can come from. I can't answer that question. All I can do is ask it for you.
Yes, Stuart again here. I read a very interesting article recently about how the Greeks dealt with running their economy, and they didn't allow narcissists to take control. And they did that by having a pool of people to select by, and then the decisions that were actually made by the group then went to another group of many thousand people to actually decide on what is actually right, what's correct, what would be the best way of going forward. And we're in a position where we have a few companies, the same the world over, with petrochemicals and plastics and others, is that basically we've got a few companies that are producing the real harm, and many organizations, many companies, and many of us, I'm actually a Quaker as well, but basically trying to do our best. But there is a way of dealing with that. I'm sure peacefully and correctly, and putting things in place where the people who don't consider the world at large, animals, insects, and everything else, particularly sentient beings, are have the wings clipped. They can't do certain things. They're not allowed to do certain things because it would be too polluting or too disruptive. Thank you.
Isn't that the role of government, to try and to regulate so that our corporate citizens become better citizens? And isn't that Rachel Carson's point? There is a need for government to regulate our corporate citizens. The market there's nothing ethical in the marketplace.
Nothing at
all. The buyer beating
Jeff.
up the seller and the seller beating down the buyer, and there's no ethics there. There's no virtue there.
I absolutely agree with you.
Mm.
So I think we seem to have lost Robert. No, we haven't. There you are, Robert.
No, I'm still here.
Yeah, right at the top there. Yeah.
I mean, I think that there are a variety of change strategies. One is to identify who are doing the best, who are establishing, who are out in front, and are really striving hard to do the right thing. And what you do is you identify them and praise them and support them as much as possible, and then try and encourage the others in the various sectors to do that. It's anecdotal. I just can't remember the quote, but if I've got it right, my understanding is that in Japan, in various manufacturing areas, what they do is they identify best practice and then say to the rest of the people in that sector, you've got 5 years to meet this challenge, because in 5 years' time, the best practice is going to become requirements for everybody. So you identify what's good and try and drag everybody else up. So that's one thing that you can do. I mean, if there are good farmers around, there are good organisations. West Farmers, which is operates Bunnings, for example, in their annual report in 2020, they talked about the fact that it is their responsibility to ensure that their customers are around in the future. And they then went on and said, as part of this, we believe that we need to adopt the model of being a circular, the circular economy model, where we do recycle everything and minimise our waste, etc., etc. So there are, and they worked with forestry authorities about 20 years ago, started 20 years ago, to develop a forestry code where which is a really good code. So if you go into Bunnings, they will all have properly, if you buy furniture there, wooden furniture, it's all properly certified from appropriate forest, etc., etc. So there's some really good success stories. David Parker quoted it about a year or two ago. He went up north to open a cement factory where they were taking all the used car tyres from vehicles and using those to actually embed in their cement process. They got some government subsidies and to do that, which was started by National. But it's a really good success story. So, one way of encouraging change is to identify where the leaders are and try and get those techniques and processes and models. But look, I'm not the sole source of wisdom in this area. You've got as much to contribute as I have. My expertise is in trying to think through the ethics, and I hope that I've been able to stimulate you to see that as a way of actually bringing about change. But there's a whole lot of other things that can be done. Just changing codes of conduct in itself is not a silver bullet.